question. So I'd like to thank Professor Ramkumar for his very in-depth and very substantial talk, and very clear that what kind of impact that these formulas will not only make on the farmers, but the entire agri supply chain. And you have started with that how the protective mechanism in means of the price policy and the marketing policies, how it helped the people to get their daily needs. Then when the government was in a situation that to further liberalize the farming, that they had given two options. Actually, you mentioned about the corporate and the contract farming, but the way that the formulas that you explained it, they combined both in a way that it benefits the corporates. That is what we are seeing, and also how they bend the constitution in order to further their agenda. That is clearly that the BJP RSS is completely going, as Golwalkar says in the bunch of thoughts, that they don't want any more states. They just want administrative units and a single executive. There is no state. That the bunch of thoughts advocates that India should be split into n number, at least a 50 number of administrative units. That's to put a person like a governor, you just administrate it. You don't have any right to make laws for yourself. That is where they are heading. And I would like to, before invite the question, I would like to mention about, as you mentioned, that it attracts a very global support. Even here during the Super Bowl, that there was a local ad in the California where they quoted Dr. King's that the threat to justice, threat to the injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That is the quote they put. And I'd like to mention only one thing from his talk, that when Professor Ramkumar talks about how the corporates become powerful, the background, I immediately recall the article that I read recently from the Nation magazine. So I don't know, I cannot show because I have put the screenshot that how the Unilever exploited the Kenya tea planters, that they exploited it and they do not know whom to complain. So eventually they went to the NGO that is funded by the Unilever, that is called UN Women, and they take a stand with the Unilever. It's very unfortunate. If you look at how many Unilever products that we are using day-to-day life, but how much it exploit the whole set of the working class. So I would like to stop here. And any questions? You can unmute yourself.
This was tremendously informative. I'd been hearing about these acts and I never really understood what it was about. And now I feel like I do. So that's very, very helpful. What was going through my mind was the 1960s, the measures in the 1960s almost sound what people would have described as socialistic, and how a lot of people sort of think that socialism is sort of a path to equality. And what we saw here is with the corporates retaining political power, this just gave rise to various other forms of capitalism. And now we're stuck with even more of a sort of Wild West, laissez-faire capitalism, except one that's with concentrated political power. It seems clear to me that the discussion has to go beyond this law or that law, this reform or that law, and has to get to the question of how the masses of people can actually take political power, and how we can imagine and construct a post-capitalist society, because food is just too basic, to let this all go by. This is core to people's, existence and subsistence. I don't know what the question is there exactly. Is that part of the conversation at all?
No, I agree with you. I mean, let me just say, there wasn't a question there, but I'm in complete agreement with you that the challenge of the time is to ensure that we are able to give the producers, particularly the small and marginal producers, they may be in agriculture or they may be in small scale industry, more authority, more power to be in charge of the labor process and in charge of the control of means of production. That is a big challenge that is emerging in this era of imperialism. the unbridled growth of corporate firms in agriculture will, over a period of time, exacerbate the problem of dispossession in the rural areas. That is something that we have to be on guard now itself. And what happened in different other Latin American examples or African examples with contract farming should make us aware that that's exactly what will happen if they are implemented in India too. And that is something that we all should be raising in opposition to these farm acts. That's something that's the kind of debate that is currently happening in India. How to give the farmer more control over his land, his produce, etc., and that as a way to ensure better democracy itself. Post-capitalist is probably a little way ahead, but certainly the debate that is currently on is how to give the producer more power in the production process, in the labor process, and so on. So I agree with you. I agree with the point that you're making, and it's not going well anywhere in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramkumar, for this wonderful presentation. I'm a TIS alumni from 10-12 batch, and I still remember your FC classes. So it was kind of a revision for me from there. So my question to you is, when I was following some conversations around this law, and some macroeconomists actually were, discussing what could be the options for India for this coming agrarian crisis. So some are saying we should, focus more on exporting our agricultural produce more, like Vietnam did, and the alternate solution could be increasing consumption of processed food in India itself. As a health professional, I did not like the second idea, because we already see in US what are the outcomes of eating more processed food. We end up, that's another behemoth we are actually might open on India's population by doing so. What are your take on this?
Thanks, Prashit. Very good to see you on this through this virtual mode after so many years. So the two questions that you raised were very, very important. That is, one is export orientation. Is it good or not? Now, we need not take a position against exports, because sometimes exports will be necessary, trade will be necessary. Every village in this world cannot be self-sufficient in terms of its requirements. But the question is, we have to, at national levels, promote the idea of not self-sufficiency, but self-reliance. It's extremely important. Self-reliance is extremely important in different core sectors of the economy, and agriculture is the most important among them. We have seen, for example, the African case of colonialism, whereby large tracts of land in Africa were converted into crops that the empire wanted for its industrial uses. It may be cocoa or rubber or sugar or whatever they may be. And these African countries in the post-colonial time also were stuck into a cropping pattern whereby they were not able to come out of that colonial cropping pattern changes, and they are not able to diversify into any new crops, and they're also not able to industrialize. Okay, so this example is right in front of us as to what. So if there are many African countries, for example, whose whole GDP, or at least 80 to 85% of the GDP, is dependent upon one crop, the export of one crop, right? And if anything happens to that price of that crop globally in 1 year, the whole GDP of that country collapses. Right? That's not a good thing. It's a very bad situation to have. So it is in this context. For India's example in the 1960s is another case. For example, India was totally dependent on the United States' wheat as part of the PL 480 program in the 1960s, prior to the Green Revolution. This meant that it's often called in India as a ship-to-mouth existence. It often meant that countries like United States could strong arm countries like India to make changes in economic policy and they were threatened that if you do not devalue your exchange rate, we will ensure that the wheat is not given to you as part of food aid. And so economic policy and economic sovereignty was sought to be violated because you did not have self-reliance in food production. Right? So all these experiences tell us that self-reliance is very important. And so exports are fine. Exports are required. They may be promoted also, but only after ensuring that you have a clear-cut policy to take care of your food security needs. Once those are met, then you can think of export-led pathways. There is no problem in that. But the problem comes when food security is thrown out of the window and indiscriminate export-oriented cropping patterns are sought to be promoted in rural areas. That's number one. The second question you raised is also important. What kind of value addition possibilities should we look at in agriculture? Should we be looking at huge multinationals coming in, creating a, as you called it, a behemoth in one way or the other, or should we look for smaller enterprises? Smaller means not very small, but small regional enterprises, using self-help groups, using joint liability groups, using groups of people, groups of farmers who can come together and participate in the process of processing and value addition. And can local markets be established to cater to the marketing needs of these products? So this is a complex question. This is a complex question that requires a lot more thought and a lot more state effort to promote. But unfortunately, nobody wants to take this path. The governments of the successive governments have always chosen the easy path of giving the whole thing to Ambani or Adani and let them deal with it, and let's pull back. So, and that's not a positive or progressive measure, and that denies the, for example, take a lot of crops. The price that is available in the final retail market is 100 rupees per kilogram, but what does the farmer get? Only 20 rupees per kilogram. Okay, and value addition possibilities are very much, the value addition is happening, and despite value addition happening, the farmer is getting only 20 rupees out of 100 rupees, and that's primarily because there's somebody who is taking huge margins out from the value chain, and that's because the predominance exists of a particular company. Nescafe is an excellent example. Nescafe sells at a huge price at the retail level, but the price that the coffee farmers, growers get at the ground level is only about 20 to 30% of that price. Right? Can you increase this 50%, 60%? That's the challenge that we face in creating farmer-friendly, local, if I'm not saying too local, say regional entities, which will look at possibilities of value addition, and thus ensuring that the farmer receives a higher share of the consumer's rupee. We have to explore those possibilities, no doubt.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was hugely informative. I had two questions. I mean, you can take one of them or both of them. That's up to you. One area that I thought you explained really well is the contract and corporate farming distinction within the laws. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the history. In my understanding, these set of laws at the national level are very much focused on the contract farming piece, whereas the corporate farming piece has come through the state levels. I mean, I know in Karnataka, for instance, where I sort of look a little bit, July 2020, some version of the laws that you were talking about came about. So if you could talk a little bit about the coordination, and is that something that's only happened in BJP-led states, or what sort of coordination have we seen between the state and the national level? And then the second question is a little bit different, but I was just wondering if you could give a little bit of a sense of one of the big responses that I think we've seen a fair bit is the government arguing that these aren't our reforms, these are the suggestions of the Swaminathan Commission. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and explain, I mean, ideally, briefly, what the gap between the Swaminathan Commission recommendations are and the types of recommendations we're seeing now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aman. Regarding your first question, you are absolutely right to insist on this difference between corporate farming and contract farming. These laws are not about corporate farming. Corporate farming is a failed model in India. In fact, it exists in some tomato farms in Punjab, or it doesn't exist beyond that. The extent of corporate farming in India is very limited. That is because a lot of restrictions continue to be there with respect to who can buy land in rural areas. Can non-farmers buy in rural areas? In some cases, domiciles are an issue. So there is a lot of restrictions which are still there with respect to who can buy and who can possess land in rural areas. And that is one reason why corporate farming has not picked up in big way. And this law, to be fair to the law, it does not look at that option. It basically looks at contract farming as the way ahead. Now, there are a lot of states which have enacted contract. And this is where I want to bring back the role of states. Do you want a one-size-fits-all law at the national level for contract farming? Or do you want regulatory laws at the local level, at the state level, by state governments who know the agricultural situation in each state, who know the specificities of farming in each state, who know the agroecological issues in each state, and then allow them to legislate for their state, what is good for their state. So if Punjab wants to have a contract farming, let Punjab do the legislation and do what is needful for that state. But to insist that Punjab's law should be the same as Tamil Nadu's law or Karnataka's law is something that does not behove a democratic country. Let's allow this to be given to the state. If one state does not want to have contract farming, let it not have it. But if some state wants to have it, let it have it, but in its own way, with its own regulations. And this idea should be very clearly laid out in these discussions. So Karnataka has a law. Karnataka has the whole BJP, non-BJP distinction is not quite applicable here, because Congress and the BJP have always been saying the same thing with respect to these legislations. Their policies are not substantively different with respect to whether they want corporate firms to come in and so on. But the point is that Congress did one thing that the BJP did not do one thing which the BJP did, which is to thrust a central law on states. Right? That the Congress did not do. They did push for these legislations, but they were persuading state governments to do it. The pathway was the same, but the constitutionality was adhered to. That is one difference. The second is that in states like Karnataka, there are some examples where it is working well. Okay, you need to learn from those experiences where it is working well to ensure that you know what a good regulation is. You don't want to end up having a bad regulation. You want to end up with a good regulation. That good regulation is one that understands the context in each state, and that understands the specificities of agrarian conditions in each state and regulates accordingly. Okay, the problem with this law is that's one of the big problems with this law. It's a one size fits all. The whole country has one regulation. Why do you want that? That's number one. In this process, I forgot your second question.
It's about the Swaminathan Commission.
Sorry. Yeah. So, the Swaminathan Commission is a huge report. It has about 4 volumes. The Swaminathan Commission recommended a lot of things which the government has not done. Okay. The Swaminathan Commission has said that MSP should be fixed at certain level above the cost of production. The government has not done that. The Swaminathan Commission has said there should be land reform. The government has not done that. The Swaminathan Commission has said there should be public investment in agricultural infrastructure. The government has not done that. But the Swaminathan Commission does say that some of these laws might need a relook, which is in the agricultural marketing sphere. No doubt about it. It says it. But the Swaminathan Commission does not say you disregard the states and do it at the central level. It says that discuss this with the states and let states adopt what is good for them. Okay, and that is something completely disregarded when these laws were established. So there's a huge difference between what Swaminathan Commission has said and what the government is doing. In many cases, and even in the case of agricultural marketing, where the Swaminathan Commission did take a friendly view, it is still the case that the Swaminathan Commission did not say, let the central government do it at the central level. That's my quick answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. So next we will have Satya who have a question. Then followed by that we will have Dalana David who has a comment. So Satya, you are able to.
Hi, Professor Ramkumar. It was really one of the most informative talks, and especially you highlighted the importance of self-reliance and also the how farmer struggle is basically anti-imperialist one, which is very that's a very important point to make. My question is that we have seen that how the developmental state has given away, and it doesn't want to take part in negotiating all these contradictions, and it is just washing its hands off to this private corporations. But do you see any other way, in a way, what is the alternative vision? Because we also know that there is a contradiction, right? Farmers' income has been stuck. There are too many people in farming. How do you ultimately resolve that contradiction? Just to give you an example, like for example, Bhagat Singh's, everyone is talking about Bhagat Singh, right? Bhagat Singh's photo is everywhere. But Bhagat Singh studied the agrarian question, and he stressed that it ultimately has to be a collectivized farming and also followed by industrialization, right? So how do you see what kind of alternative vision you want to give?
Satya, thank you for that question. Very important question, but I'm not very sure if I have the time to answer your question, because it's probably a seminar in itself. But one thing let me start with, which is that the idea of developmental state that you mentioned. I do not think India had a developmental state. Okay, South Korea had a developmental state. Taiwan had a developmental state. India did not have a developmental state. If India had a developmental state, it would have done land reform. It would have done broader agrarian reforms to grow agriculture, and from there create a home market and lead to industrialization with public investment leading the way, if not public regulation leading the way, as in some of the East Asian countries. So the whole Indian experience is fundamentally different from other successful cases of post-colonial economic transformation, as in East Asia, or even in countries like Mexico, what you saw, India has not seen. Right? So it is fundamentally different in that way, number one. Number two, what you're saying is again very important. Can you do without structural change? Can you do without industrialization? I don't think it can be. They are feasible pathways at all. You cannot get stuck with the 50% population in agriculture forever. Right? You have to think of alternative ways of employing them. But as you know, the very history of industrialization has been marked by our inability to create a rural market, right? Our inability to expand our home market, expand the purchasing power of people in the rural areas. Even today, if the rain does not come in June, it's not the farmers who have a blood pressure problem. It is the industrialists who have a blood pressure problem, because that will lead to a huge fall in rural demand. And most of their commodities are sold in rural area. India has enormous possibilities of industrial growth if the rural market is vibrant, if the rural purchasing power goes up. But we are unable to make agriculture profitable. I'm very superficial here because I don't have time. But the only way to create a market for industrial goods is to grow rural incomes. Right? And if rural incomes have to grow, agricultural incomes have to grow. And if agricultural incomes have to grow, experience tells us that the government has to play a very important interventionary and regulatory role in the agrarian economy. Unfortunately, what you see is the government withdrawing from that role and allowing corporates to take over. And they see that as a shortcut to agricultural growth. But then the problem is that shortcut would mean that the surplus that is produced does not stay with the producer. It is actually drained away by a company or a firm, and is not necessarily reinvested in agriculture. So both income suffer, as also capital accumulation suffers, right? And you're left neither here nor there as a result. So there are a lot of these contradictions with policies which have existed. The contradictions existed from the time of independence, but they have been exacerbated or made more complicated by the whole liberalization regime, the globalization regime that we have had. So it's not an easy task, but I agree with what is to be done with you. But whether the contradictions can be resolved is anybody's guess. I'm not very sure about it, but it doesn't look like the contradictions are going to be resolved anytime soon, and that's a sad part of the story, because enormous numbers of small producers are associated with this system, and their lives will become more miserable. Society will become more unequal as a result of this phenomenon. Well, I don't know. Maybe if people's movements grow, progressive politics takes root, then over a period of time, there will be change. But one has to wait. So, sorry, as I said, your answer requires a big, long half-an-hour answer, but I had to limit it to a few minutes. So it may have been superficial, but they are my quick thoughts.
Hi, thanks, Satya. Thank you, Ram.
Great. So I'll be really brief and great informative talk. And I don't think we get an opportunity to hear so much information by just reading like 300-word newspaper articles and stuff like that. So thank you very much, Professor. So my question is the long-term effects of the laws, right? So for example, what will be the impact on labor migration, for example, right? So I know a lot of people moving from Punjab, doing cultivation in Chhattisgarh and all those places and coming back. So what will be the impact of this kind of migration with these laws being introduced?
The impact will be indirect, and it will depend on how things will unfold in agriculture itself, right? Now, if you will see a situation whereby big corporate firms take over the process of production and cultivation, or including marketing in rural areas, then you might see pockets where there will be increased labor migration from other areas, because there will be some employment that will be created. And but this will be like the large, humongous meat plants of the United States, whereby which accommodate thousands of people under one roof, right? Like, for example, the Tyson Foods, for example, those kinds of companies. So if those kinds of large firms come, then there will be some pointed in migration to some places. But as of now, it's very difficult to speculate on what exactly. But over a period of time, if small producers get more marginalized in the production process, they end up being dispossessed of land and so on, and they are left with only their labor power to sell in the market, then they will be forced to migrate. Even today, because even when land loss is not a very important problem in rural areas, people still migrate because agriculture is not profitable. So what you know is you don't need people to lose land in order for them to migrate. Even when they keep land, the sheer lack of profitability of that land can push them to migration, right? So you already see that, and that process will certainly exacerbate in the future if it goes as it is going now. No doubt about it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say I come from a public health background, and I'm really concerned about what this will do for nutrition in India with contract farming. And I just wanted to say that I'd done a study in Kerala looking at farmer groups, particularly women farmers in Alappuzha district, who are doing panchayat-based farming, as well as comparing that to farmers from, with mostly male farmers with more land in another district. And I found that the diversity of diet among the farmers in Alappuzha was as good, if not better, than higher income people in other places. I was looking at diversity of diet. Are they getting the green leafy vegetables? Are they getting, what kind of things, what kind of education and understanding of diet do they have? And I was blown away by this. And this was because, and there was a question of trust as well. I just found that the trust that these people had in the panchayat in Alappuzha was completely different from the trust that was really not there in the other panchayat. And it was because of all the community development work that had happened and farming that had happened, that they were doing it it was sustainable, and it was organic, and it was, all the good things. And they were getting good income. And they were buying and selling from each other in a way. And plus they had other centralized marketing systems as well. So such a model can really help, and it is an alternative to these kind of exploitative models.
Thank you, Dalina. It's a very important question, because I did suggest a little while back that we need to look at alternatives at the local and regional levels, whereby we can create forms of production organization which are fundamentally different from the corporate model that is being pushed. And there, some of the experiments in Kerala have great promise. For example, if you take women in farming in Kerala, the Kudumbashri experiment in women farming, where joint liability groups cultivate something like 30,000 acres in the whole state, as we are speaking. And that's a very important model to ensure that there is access to land and other resources for otherwise propertyless or assetless sections of the society. Number one, they have a certain assured income. They are able to participate in the production process, and you secure their livelihoods as a result. You don't leave them to the mercy of large multinational firms or private corporate firms, but instead you integrate them into a more you democratically integrate them into the process of production and growth. It's still capitalism. It's not it's not a post-capitalist model, but you live in the capitalist society of India, so will have to create alternatives from within slowly, which can be tomorrow's post-capitalist forms of organization, if all happens well, and if the revolution comes tomorrow. So the point is that these experiments have great value, but and of course, to add to it, you made the point about nutrition. It also is a pathway to ensure nutrition security to the poorer sections of our society, no doubt about it. But I want to insist here that this requires a certain political will, as in Kerala. This requires a certain political character of the state, as in Kerala. And this does not obtain itself in other parts of India. In other parts of India, if an initiative like Kudumbashri or women farming in such groups requires enormous amount of state intervention and state action. Right? You need to deploy people, you need to have a policy, you need to go and help them, you need to work with them, you need to guide them, you need to train them. It's not an easy task. But does the state have the capacity to do it? Does the state have the will to do it? Does policy allow for it? That's a question. The policy allows for it in Kerala. The politics allows for it in Kerala, because there's a certain left politics that is there in Kerala, which is not available in other states. If you go to other states, states much prefer, or bureaucrats much prefer, to simply leave it to big corporate firms and forget the story, or they will take care of it. We don't want to get into it. They will say, no, the government is highly inefficient. The government cannot do it. The private firms will do it better. Okay. But there are areas where the private firms may do things more interestingly than the government. Have them there. There's no problem. But the point is the centrality of the role in terms of intervention, in terms of policy making, design of schemes, regulation, has to lie with the state. And that is why you are able to get such interesting experiments in Kerala, as opposed to not having them in other states. Again, I would have loved to speak a lot more on this, but time is of essence, and I need to keep it brief and hence superficial. Sorry.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for your comments. They were very helpful in understanding what the laws are. And it's in what you were saying, it seems to me that you're right. I agree with you. And it's really true that local farming, regional farming, self-sufficiency would all be better, but the laws of capitalism work in a certain way. Like Marx said, one capitalist kills many. So people were saying that to think about post-capitalism is like a dream, but there's all these masses of people in the streets in India right now, farmers, farm workers, small farmers, workers, strikes. And if those people had the vision of a world where markets didn't exist, where we only produced for need and we shared it, all these problems would be solved by the masses. And I think that's more realistic than thinking that capitalism can be made to serve the needs of the masses. So I think real communism, not socialism, not money, not markets, but actually directly producing and sharing for need will work. Anyway, but thank you. It's very interesting.
Thank you, Barbara. I agree with you. But just one sentence I will add to it. It's important to understand that this particular task that we are talking about is much more complicated in India compared to a developed capitalist country, because in large parts of India, the kind of capitalist transformation that we have already seen in many other parts of the world have not yet happened. And that actually complicates the whole process. The absence of the presence of an incomplete capitalist transformation makes it even more complicated a matter to think about a post-capitalist world. Post-capitalist is what comes after capitalism. But if you have if you don't have capitalism as yet, what will you do with the post-capitalist dream? So these are complications which exist in the Indian context, and there is a lot of. I give the example of Kerala, where the Communist Party there is trying to create an alternative. Of course, within the larger Indian capitalist framework, but creating concrete alternatives of what could be tomorrow's post-capitalist enterprises. We create smaller people's alternatives today itself to be ready for that transformation tomorrow, and that is extremely important to take note of in India. But I want to say, as a broad point to your answer, that unfortunately, how much ever we might want it or love it, a plunge into a post-capitalist society is a bit premature in certain societies like India. And I want to, and that's unfortunately the case. So that's what I would quickly mention as a response. But I completely agree with you that capitalism is a monstrous system, and it has to go. On that we are together.
Thank you. And Professor Ram, if you want to say something at the conclusion, as a conclusion, then please go ahead.
No, I don't want to say anything. I want to thank all of you for this invitation and for the patience. I'm sure it's a very cold evening in the United States, but you have found time to sit and listen to me. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting. Happy to cooperate in the future also.